So, hello everyone. One second, let me just spotlight myself. Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for logging on and attending today's virtual program. My name is Matt Schumann. I am on the programming team here at Cary Library. Before we begin, please let me know in the chat if there are any technical issues I can try to resolve. Questions can be asked through the chat as well. This program is made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation. I'd like to now introduce Ed Winters. Ed is a Lexingtonian who can speak endlessly about coffee. He is an engineer by trade who for decades has searched for the perfect brew. Currently, Ed brews coffee using almost a dozen methods, seeking the best from each through many technical means. He has also roasted for over 2 years with beans from around the globe with goals of experiencing the perfect cup. So now I'd like to please welcome Ed Winters.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Yes, welcome. This is my my little coffee room that I got here. And as Matt said, I have been roasting coffee or brewing coffee anyway for at least 30 years while being an electrical engineer. So if I get a little too technical, let me know at the end. I'd like to know your feedback. So let me briefly show you what I got for a setup here. I got myself a little coffee room. I have a lot of brewers I'm going to talk about today. And over in this side here, I got myself a coffee roaster, which I've been using for several years now, roasting my own coffees. And I recently picked up a commercial espresso machine because I love espressos. So let me first zoom in on my my TV screen here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how to brew coffee, things that you need to know in order to brew good coffee. A lot of people don't know, and there's a lot of material out there that I think is either right or wrong or somewhat different. So let me first start by explaining how to choose the right coffee. I think that's number one. When you go to this store or a coffee shop, you just pick up a bag of coffee, and by God, there's these flavor descriptors on the bag, and they just sound wonderful, and you want to bring them home and experience those flavors. And a lot of times, at least this happened to me early on, it didn't happen. I was very shocked. I was very unhappy with the bag of coffee that I bought. I didn't get any of these. And it turned out after a lot of years of doing this that I was really not brewing it correctly. And I also didn't understand what these all meant. So what they really mean, you're going to bring all coffee home. All coffee is going to taste a bit like coffee. But if you really wanted to know the difference between this coffee and that coffee, these are descriptors that the roaster put on the bag to help you identify what kind of roast they are. In order to get these types of flavors in your coffee and your taste, you really need to brew it to the sweet spot. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what I call the sweet spot. It's not my term, but it is something that that's out there. Here I got a curve. I threw this together about really generally all coffees. All coffees, when you brew them, have 850 flavors. And it starts off with some bitter acids or some sour acids, goes into some flavor oils, some caramels, and finally end up with some roast bitterness. Now, in order to get to the sweet spot when you roast coffee, or when you brew coffee, you want to brew until you get a balance of the sours and the bitters. So you want to stop the coffee at just the right time, or just, and then have the right temperatures and the right grinds so that you go through all the way through, get all the flavors that you can out of the coffee, but not too much, and end up canceling the bitter and the acids to get the sweet spot. And that's really the goal of whatever brew method you use, whether it be a Keurig all the way to an espresso machine. And there's a couple knobs you have to do that. One is time. This axis here is time. You get the acids first, oils, caramels, and finally the bitters. So You could stop it at a certain time and you'll end up with more sours and no bitters. The other thing you could do is grind finer. If you grind finer, time goes faster. You'll get to this end over here much quicker. And the last thing that you have for adjustments is temperature. If you're very hot, you'll zoom across this thing really quickly. If you're very cool, you may not ever get to the bitterness. So choosing a bag of coffee, a lot of times roasters either roast a dark roast or a light roast and everything in between. So these flavor are going to be different between one bag of coffee and the other if it's roasted light versus roasted dark. So one thing you can look at the bag is if it says that it's bold roastiness, low acidity, strong caramel or chocolate, chances are it's a dark roast. And in a dark roast, way over here on the side at the end of the brew is going to be some really strong flavor, and it's going to be a bit on the bitter side. On the other side of the spectrum, if you find a bag of roast and it says that it's citrusy, it's fruity, it's sweet, and has a lot of that flowery aroma, chances are it's going to be a light roast. And light roasts, unlike a dark roast, have a lot of acidity up front and have very low bitterness that comes out at the end. And with a roast like this, you really want to go and extract every single thing you can out of the coffee in order to get to that sweet spot. But on a dark roast, you may not want to go all the way to the end because you're going to end up with a lot of bitterness and not enough acidity to balance that out to the sweet spot. So often with dark roasts, you either brew with a little lower temperature or you stop the roast early before you get too bitter. And that's the technique that I hope I will convey. And it really applies to every single brew method out there. And I'm going to talk about a bunch of those later. Another thing, if you don't have flavor notes on the bag of coffee, you can look at the coffee. If there's oily beans, they're very dark in color, often described as a French roast or something like that, chances are it's a dark roast. Almost every single dark roast is oily. It's going to have a lot of bitterness, a lot of chocolatey flavors, roasty flavors, and have almost no acidity. Medium roasts don't have any oiliness usually. They're kind of just chocolatey brown, kind of flat in color. Usually between the beans, a little on the white side, but sometimes on the little darker side. Light roast looks very similar to medium roast, but if you look at the texture of the bean itself, there's usually some irregular surface texture. Sometimes you have some shaft still left on them. Usually it's very white in between the crack in the bean, and that's usually an indication of a light roast. In which case you'll get a lot of acidity, not a lot of bitterness, not a lot of chocolatey flavors at all. So I would like to I'd like to introduce that everybody should really try to explore outside of their comfort zone a little bit with this. So if you explore and try something different, say you bought a nice Ethiopian micro lot coffee and you tried it out in your favorite brewer and it just was awful, don't give up, okay? It might be a light roast, and a light roast may not blend very well with the brew method that you have. Try blending it with a dark roast. Pick up another bag. Go to Starbucks and get yourself a nice dark roast. Mix it 50-50 with the light roast. You might be surprised that that'll balance out and get you to a better sweet spot than if you had either of those coffees separately in your brewer. So that's another adjustment technique that you can play around with. Again, it works the other way around. So you had a really dark roast, it tastes like charcoal. Somebody gave it to you, came from Kona out in Hawaii. Again, you can mix it with a light roast. Buy a bag of light roast just for that reason. Blend it up. You know, do some experimenting. But if you found in the back of your refrigerator an old bag of coffee has been there for a while, nice expensive Panama coffee, and it tastes a little bit like cardboard, it's really no hope. Don't try blending that with anything else. It's not going to get any better. It's good for, you know, maybe your garden. So some considerations when brewing coffee. The first consideration is brew ratio. Brew ratio is the weight of the water divided by the weight of the coffee grains. You really should adhere to standards with that and not really try to explore too far outside of the standards. If you're brewing a normal cup of coffee, the standard that usually is set forward is a 16:1 ratio. Just to let you know, I got it written down here, 16:1 ratio is about 1.5 scoops. I got a scoop here, it's 10 grams. 1.5 scoops for an 8-ounce cup. Two of these scoops is typically more than that. So it's good to stay with that brew ratio and adhere to it the best you can. If you have a scale for measuring, that's also highly advisable. Water, really consider your water. Lexington water, come to find out, is actually very good as a solvent for brewing coffee. It's a soft water. It doesn't have a lot of bad chemicals in it. It's actually very good for coffee. But other towns around the state tend to not have good water for coffee. And oh, by the way, I made this mistake too. I went and bought myself some beautiful, great tasting spring water. It's also really bad for brewing coffee because it's hard. And hard water makes a very bad solvent. It doesn't pull all those wonderful things out of your coffee anywhere near as well as a soft water. So when you're out looking for water, try to find one that's soft, and go with that. So the other thing I'd like to talk about is an immersion versus infusion brew. I get confused by the two, but really infusion is just that. You're putting your water through coffee continuously when you're brewing. The other is an immersion brew. French press, for instance, is an immersion brew. You mix the coffee with your water and let it sit. Because infusion brew, you're constantly putting fresh water through your brew, it can extract better than an immersion brew. An immersion brew, the solvent capabilities of the water get less versus time because it's getting all clogged up with the coffee. That doesn't mean it makes a bad cup of coffee. It just means you probably got to adjust your brew ratio a little bit lower. And typically with an immersion brew, a 14 to 15 is quite acceptable to get the right strength brew at the end. So your real knobs that you have for adjusting and brewing good coffee is time and temperature and grind. More time, it ends up extracting more. Higher temperature, you tend to extract more and quicker. The grind, the finer the grind you go, the more you're going to extract. To an extent, what often happens in brews, and people make this mistake all the time, is they grind too fine, in which case the water finds another path to go into your cup than through the coffee. And in that case, you don't get hardly any extraction. You get a messy brewer. It brings the grinds into your cup sometimes with some brews, so try to avoid that. Another thing you can explore is paper versus metal filters. A lot of breweries allow both. Paper filters will filter out coffee oils. Coffee oils gives you a little bit of mouthfeel. It gives you some different flavors. Metal filters allow everything to go into your cup. So explore that if you want. I like them both. And the other thing when choosing a brewer, a lot of brewers, for instance, simple pour-overs are good for one cup. If you have a grouping of people, they're really not a good brew method to use. A multi-cup brewer is the only path you can have for more than one people. So keep that in mind. All right, let's, you want to zoom that in, Pam, to, I'm going to start talking about each and every brewer in a little bit more depth.
Good.
How's that? Okay, good. I'm going to try to choose, you know, these are all my brewers. I have a Keurig. This is, I'm going to choose this one first to talk about. It's probably one of the most used common brewers out there. I know tons of people that ask me questions. They want my coffee put into their Keurig, and that's fine. But I would like to talk a little bit about how they operate. They're actually they're an infusion brewer, which extracts very well. Being an infusion brewer, the quality of the unit is surprisingly well compared to a lot of drip brewers. The adjustments that you can make with one of these is where they start to fall short. They are a fixed temperature. I've measured temperatures on a couple of them now, and they're a little low compared to normal brew standards, but they're not bad, and they're very consistent. And the brew times, it forces the water through the brew rather quickly, actually. And because of some of that, you tend to end up with slightly unextracted brews out of a Keurig. But there are things that, and probably the last thing I'd like to mention is the brew ratios. It's really hard to get a 16:1 brew ratio with a Keurig, especially if you have a model that you can choose more and more cups, bigger cups. Is way underneath it's way over rather the 16:1 ratio, which tends to end up with a pretty weak brew. I've tried probably every type of refillable cup there is, and I came to liking best the Keurig My K-Cup. It holds the most coffee, so I could then adhere a little lot closer to the 16:1 standard. It also really forces the water through all the coffee and doesn't allow it to come out the sides before going through the coffee, so you can grind a little finer with this, again aiding the extraction and getting the most extraction I can out of my coffees. So that's my choice there. The other thing that you need to keep in mind with this brewer, because of the cooler temperature and its ability to, and no ability to adjust time, you really need to choose a coffee that's either a dark roast or maybe a medium roast. Trying to extract a light roast. Like I showed earlier, you really need to extract everything the coffee's got in it, which takes more time, a little finer grind. You just can't get there with a Keurig brewer to do that. So if you got a bag of coffee, it costs you a bunch of money, and it says that it's you know, got a lot of fruit flavors and so forth in it, I mean, this is not the brewer to put that in. Go for the chocolatey, go for the little darker roasts, and I think you'll be happy with it. I have one of these at work. I do use it actually once in a while for good brews. The next coffee maker, which is very common, is a drip brewer. This one isn't a drip brewer, but it looks like a drip brewer. Drip brewers, similar to a Keurig, is an infusion brew. It can do multi-cups, and I recommend that whenever you use one of these, you do brew a full carafe. When you start trying to brew much less than a carafe, or much less than the coffee bed gets so shallow that it doesn't extract properly. They do best when they're full. A lot of times you can use a paper filter, or in this one here, you can use a metal filter as well if you like the coffee oils in your coffee, make it a little more better mouthfeel. One problem with the standard drip brew, as with the Keurig, they're usually fixed temperature and fixed brew time. What you do have for adjustability range with one of these is then your grind. You can adjust the amount of grind up or down to get a little more bitter, a little more sour, and finally dial it right into your sweet spot. It's usually very possible. Again, most of them that I've tested, the temperature is a little on the cooler side and the times are a little quick, but usually short, longer than the Keurig. They're really best for brewing darker to medium roasts. Light roasts, not so well. It's hard to get the sweet spot with a light roast. So then I would like to introduce you to a specialty coffee roaster, and I gave it that name, but really the Specialty Coffee Organization has a website that has certified brewers, this being one of them actually. It looks just like a drip brewer, but what it has over a normal drip brewer is a couple of really good features. One of them, you can adjust the temperature. So when you have a light roast, I often bump the temperature up to over 200 Fahrenheit, somewhere around 205, some roasters recommend. You can do that with a specialty coffee certified brewer. Another thing they offer is a pre-infusion phase. And what that does, if you have a fresh roasted coffee off the roast machine only a day old, it has a lot of carbon dioxide pressure inside the coffee itself. So when the hot water hits it for the first time, it balloons up. That causes poor extraction. And so with a pre-infusion feature that's on one of these machines, it wets the coffee and then it waits. And there's usually adjustable wait period for that. And then it continues. And it usually infuses and stops, infuses some more. So you're really extracting the heck out of the coffee. And that is really important to do with a light roasted coffee. When you do that and you get to your sweet spot, what usually happens is you tend to not want to go back to a really dark roast again because it's that good. If you want to play around with that and not spend the money for one of these big brewers and it's just by yourself, you can go out and reasonably low money buy yourself a pour-over brewer. Pour-over brewers, you buy a kettle that has a gooseneck, and you can control the flow of the hot water in there by yourself. You can control the amount of grinds you put in there. It's the ultimate in terms of flexibility, and it didn't cost you a whole lot. Of course, most of us, when you have that many adjustment ranges and things to adjust, it's probably, at least this worked out for me, it's not a brewer that you probably want to use every single day. Unless maybe you get good at it, the people that do it, but I find sometimes it's just too many adjustments, doesn't make things easier. But this brewer, if you want to try out a new coffee, some light roasted coffee, get it to the sweet spot, find out what it takes to get it to the sweet spot, there's really no better way of doing it than to pour over. I would like to show you this pour over. This is one that has a valve in it. They call it a dripper. This company Bonavita makes this one, but there's another company called Clever that makes a dripper. It has a valve at the bottom of it. Now a valve is kind of a cool thing. If you ground your coffee a bit too coarse and it was flowing through there too quickly, and you knew it was going to end up with not extracting it enough, you can stop it just by shutting the valve. It'll stop. You can continue with it later. You can close it for the whole brew, making it closer to being a French press brew, but without the grinds. So I like these things. They're really great. So then the next most common breath method is a French press. French press is an immersion brew, much different than the last two that I had. An immersion brew, you pour the grinds into here, usually a coarser grind, because you get too fine with a French press, the fine grinds will go right through this filter and end up in your cup. And I don't like grinds in my coffee. I don't know about you. They're a wonderful brewer. You usually got to put a little bit more coffee in for your water. Ratios, like I said earlier, are around 14 to 15 to 1 instead of the standard 16 to 1. They come in different sizes. So you can do a couple cups. This one here is a single cup. This is an insulated model, so it holds the heat a little bit better than it doesn't break as quickly as the glass ones. I like it. I don't use it every day. It tends to get a little messy in cleaning out all those grinds. I don't like pulling grinds down my drain, so I have to scoop them out. It takes a little bit of time, but it offers a lot of adjustable range. You can adjust your temperature, you can adjust your time, you can adjust your grinds. All the knobs for adjusting and getting to that sweet spot are available with a French press. You can brew a light versus dark roast and get good results. The other next brew method I would like to show you is an AeroPress. The AeroPresses came out a number of years ago, and they immediately shot up throughout the world as being a fantastic brew method. What they are is really they're almost a French press, but not quite. What you do with this thing is you put a paper filter in here, so they're going to filter the coffee through paper instead of. And you can buy a metal one too if you want the oils. Screw it onto here, and you can pour in your grinds, pour in the water just like you do with the French press. Stir it up, and then push it down through. So how is it different than a French press? Well, one thing you can do with an AeroPress that you can't do with a French press is you can grind significantly finer. And because you can grind significantly finer, you can push it through much quicker. You can also push it through with less water. So what commonly is done with an AeroPress is they do no longer adhere to the brew ratios of 15 and 16 to 1. You can bump this down to a 5 to 1 brew ratio and end up with a really concentrated coffee at the end. That's still well balanced if you do it properly. What that allows you to do is if you add milk, or if you add other things to your coffees, you'll end up with a really nice strong brew. And good coffees, are much better with a strong brew than they are with a weak brew. You can really taste all those flavors that coffee has to offer, the stronger it gets. At least that's my opinion. And an AeroPress allows you to do that. And it turns out AeroPresses became so popular. I think in Europe and other places, they have competitions. There's tons of recipes out there from these competitions on the internet. They're wonderful to try. They are also a wonderful machine for traveling. You can put everything together. There's people on the web that have little hand grinders that can fit right inside of here, and they all fits in your travel case, and off you go. You do need boiling water, which you can get out of most microwaves, but they're a wonderful brew method if you want to do something to try. They're not very expensive either, something like $30. Oh, and they're easy to clean up. I forgot to mention that. When you finish compressing the grinds, that cap comes off, and you pop a compressed puck of coffee right into your trash. Very simple to clean up. You only do 1 cup. That's its downfall. Next brew method is a Moka pot. Moka pots are what a lot of people consider a stovetop espressos. Stovetop espressos they're really designed by the Italians to make a really strong cup of coffee. They're actually not as strong as a true espresso, but they're pretty close. And you can get the same strength brew as one of these with an AeroPress, but these are very simple. These take out a lot of variables that you have with an AeroPress that you may not want to deal with. You simply put water in here up to this fine coffee, level it off. You don't have to tamp it. close it up, put it on a burner, watch it. When it comes out and starts to gurgle at the end, you pull it off, pour it into your cup, and you have a concentrated brew. A lot of people don't like really strong brews like that. Don't be afraid to add water if it's too strong. It's a common drink called an Americano. Strong espresso mixed with hot water, and it becomes a standard strength brew. And it's also very good because if you extract the coffee properly, whether you extract it dark or you extract it light, you get that sweet spot. Doesn't matter. You add more water or less water, you can dial it into the right strength you want. It's always going to be good if it's extracted good. So that's the Moka Pot. And I've actually used that for many years, and it turns out, maybe I should mention this, is a lot of people believe that you cannot brew, have any adjustments on the temperature at all. Turns out you do. There is you can adjust the level of water in here up and down a little bit, and that modifies the temperature you brew a little bit. And if you're getting too bitter, you may lower the water a little bit, causing it to cool off, and pull out some more of that sourness to cancel the bitterness and get a little sweeter brew. They're best to be used with sort of dark to medium roasts. Light roasts are not as well in one of these because they are a little on the limited side. But they're not a bad brew method, and again, they're very portable. And they come big and small. I have a really big one. This one here is a 10-cup Italian cup. Italian cups are not exactly the same as a U.S. cup, as you probably can imagine. Italian cups are on the order of 7 grams, very small amount. So this is a 10-cup. It actually can serve 10 people. Small little cups. Next coffee brewer that I'd like to mention, it's often forgotten about, is a percolator. It's not as common anymore. I still have one. My mom still uses hers. I grew up at home with a percolator. A lot of people, a lot of myths with this thing, thinking boiling water is going through your coffee. That's bad. Turns out I actually logged the temperatures coming out of this and going through my coffee. And while the force of the water up the tube in the middle and out to your coffee is actually boiling at the base, it travels up this tube through cooler water on the way up. And by the time it comes out the top, it's no longer boiling anymore. My logs show it's about 180 degrees Fahrenheit at the beginning of your brew, and it slowly but surely rises up until when your brew is just about done, it is close to boiling. And the trick of one of these things is to stop it before it gets anywhere near that boiling temperature. So when you start seeing nice brown coffee come in this, and it's starting to get that nice smell, you may think about taking it off the burner and giving it a taste. You can always put it back on. Log that amount of time. They are capable of extracting good coffee from light versus dark, and they come in small sizes like this one. They have big coffee urns that are percolators that do 100 cups, U.S. cups. They're actually a pretty good brew method, better than a lot of people think. Let's see. So the espressos. This is my first espresso machine, and there are imitation machines out there for significantly less money than one of these. That turns out, I found out, are not really espresso machines. They don't build up the right number of pressure. They don't regulate the temperature anywhere near as close as you need. The volumes are rather inconsistent. You got to pay extra money to get a good espresso machine, to get good espresso. This one here I got off of Craigslist for about $300, and then I had to rebuild all the seals. By the way, there's a lot of maintenance with espresso machines. My coffee grinder, a manual grinder. It looks reasonably cheap. This one here is designed for espresso, and I paid about $200 for this unit. It's a really good grinder. I wouldn't recommend anybody getting it unless they want to do espressos, but if you want to go cheap, this setup is about as cheap as I would recommend. And there's a lot of fussing. You take all these brew methods, add all the fussing. That's how you get a good espresso, is fussing. Let's see. So, additions to coffee. So, I talked about all the brew methods that I got here. A lot of people put things in their coffee. I would like to mention, if you really want to evaluate your coffee brew, the best way to do it is with it black. It took me a while to develop a palate for accepting that. Also tried letting it cool. Your taste buds is so much better at room temperature than they are at boiling temperature. 120 degrees Fahrenheit is typically the best temperature to judge the flavor of your coffee. Let it cool down. A hot cup of coffee is not a better cup of coffee unless it's not a good cup of coffee to start with. Adding cream, sugar, it's wonderful to do to coffee. It hides a lot of mistakes and makes it taste very good, but it also hides all those mistakes. And if you want to fix some of those mistakes, you can't judge it with a lot of cream and sugars and other additives to your coffee. But if you do, and I highly recommend that you try different things. There's non-dairy milks nowadays that are very good, oats and nut milks that are very good. There's some spices. Cardamom is very common to put into coffee, for instance. Frothing milk. This machine here has a steam wand for frothing milk, and you can do it other ways. It's another interesting technique that brings out sweetness. Froth milk turns out doubles this. Typically, froth milk is double this volume after you frothed it. So all the fats and so forth that you don't want are that much less when you froth milk, and it makes the milk, for some reason, and I'm not a chemist, a bit on the sweeter side. So it's another technique to get away from sugars. Froth milk is a good alternative. Cups. A lot of times you think that a cup of coffee doesn't matter the cup. Paper cup, porcelain cup, doesn't matter. It turns out it does matter, particularly as you get into espressos. You want to have a cup that actually holds in some of the aromas, holds the heat a little bit better. All that stuff improves the experience with your coffee a little bit. The aroma in your nose actually can help your flavor of the coffee come out stronger, it turns out. And when you get into espressos, spreading out the crema that comes out of an espresso with the right cup is also important to get a balanced flavor. So don't underestimate cups. They're very important. So that's about it relative to what I had to show you with the different brewers. And I guess I would like to open it up to any questions. I can back up and go through any one of these.
There was a question in the chat, two of them actually. It was, what is the brand of the multi-cup brewer that you were showing?
This multi-cup brewer, I assume this here is a B-More. There's a couple other brands out there that are very good. This one, you pour the water in the top, it brings it up to the precise right temperature where it allows it to come down through. It's an excellent brewer. I can get a 22% extraction yield with this really simply. The only downfall of this brewer that I can tell you about, people complain about, is its height. Some cabinets and kitchens don't allow this to go under it very well. I don't have a problem with that here, but as a The other problem is it's not a really big brewer. I believe it's a 10 cup. Some people like a little bit more, but it's an excellent brewer.
And are there any brands that you recommend otherwise?
For brewers like this, there's a couple other good brands. I don't know, off the top of my head, there's Bonavita makes a very nice brand. It's this is a company that makes my dripper, also makes these type of brews. They have some specialty coffee. Maybe what the best thing I should do is provide you guys with a link to the Specialty Coffee Organization certified brewer list, and it's a very long list of excellent brewers, and that would probably give you open the doors to a lot of different options.
Yeah, we could absolutely send that out after in the recap. So, someone also asked, what is the recommended water temperature for the French press?
Well, it could be. I would start with 200 Fahrenheit. That's typically what the SEA recommends for the standard brew is 200 Fahrenheit. Now the trick is do you boil your water and let it go down to 200 Fahrenheit in your kettle, or when you pour it in, is it 200 Fahrenheit? And that's sort of up for debate, but my opinion is when it's coming out of your kettle into this brew, it's 200 Fahrenheit. And it may settle to something lower than that once it hits your coffee. Some people warm up their French press a little bit by putting a little water in first before they put in the coffee. But again, taste is king. If your coffee is coming up way too bitter, you might want to drop your temperature a little bit, or change your grind.
Someone was curious. Will you be? There's actually a lot of questions that just came in, but will you also be sharing your presentation or slide deck with us after? I can also, if you wanted to, I could send that out in the recap.
Sure.
Okay. Do you, or someone said that they don't have a good grinder. Are they better off with ground coffee in a sealed bag?
That's an excellent question. There's a lot of grinders out there. You can get them at department stores. That it's been proven that a coffee shop grinder, after a week of being ground, is still producing better coffee than one freshly ground out of a inexpensive department store grinders. So my recommendation is to buy it ground if you're really not interested in paying enough money to get a decent grinder. It kind of depends on what you're brewing. You don't need a $200 grinder for a French press. You don't need a $200 grinder for a Keurig or one of these machines here. You do need a $200 grinder or even more for an espresso machine. It's just, there's no questions about it. You need to grind right before you brew for espressos. There's no options about it. It's the main adjustment that you have when you're brewing espressos is your grind. If it's coming out too bitter or weak, you're adjusting your grind. That's typically what you do. But a lot of these other brew methods, sure, you can grind it ahead of time. What typically happens is if you bought it pre-ground, is some of the aromas that you get out of the coffee tend to disappear with time, and they have valved bags and so forth that help hold things in, but it typically they don't work that well. I like to put my coffees in. Let me show you in ball jars. You get a ball jar, you get your ground coffee, you brought it out of freshly ground, you put it in a ball jar, close it up tight, and stick it in the freezer. Freezers have got all kinds of nasty smells. They can't get through a ball jar. And so that's, I think, the best way to keep your coffee from all the aromas and everything intact. And you can hold a coffee pretty fresh in one of these things. If it's pre-ground, at least a week. If it's beaned coffee, I can easily go a month before I grind it, and it still tastes quite good out of a bowl jar. Hope that answers your question.
There's a couple more. Someone noticed that you have a thermal carafe. Some tend to get coffee stains. Does that impact the flavor over time?
Old coffee tends to not help your coffee. So I like to keep everything clean, particularly the shower up here. It gets disgusting over time, and that needs to be cleaned. I clean everything out, the carafe included. A little bit in here from the day before usually washes out pretty good. A couple little stains here and there may not contribute too much. In general, old coffee sitting there doesn't add good things flavor-wise to your coffee, my experience.
This next question, I remember we were talking about when we were practicing, but how can we make good cold brewing?
Oh, cold brew. I didn't talk about cold brew. I have done a decent amount of cold brews. Those curves that I showed you on the display earlier almost don't apply to cold brews. And it's mainly because you're brewing with room temperature water or colder. And what happens is the time and what comes out of the coffee drastically changes when you go that cold, that far away from the standard brew temperatures. And for better, for worse, I find that most of the high acidity, light roasted coffees, the acidity doesn't come out when you cold brew. I can brew it for 24 hours in the fridge with really coarse grinds and not get a single trait of any fruitiness coming out into my cold brew. But a nice medium roast or a nice dark roast brewed 16 hours in the fridge with grinds usually can make a very nice cup. It's probably a topic that I could do on a different talk. Wouldn't mind doing.
And the last question so far, though people are more than welcome to continue asking some, are should you store coffee in the refrigerator, freezer, or room temperature?
That comes up a lot. Typically, the colder you can keep your coffee, the longer it's going to stay fresh. Leaving it at room temperature, oxygen tends to react with it, and other reactions happen to it much quicker than at colder temperatures. If you put it into a good container that shields it from any odors that happen to be lingering in your refrigerator or in your freezer, it really won't matter anymore if it's the fridge or the freezer. I know people that take their roasted coffee and they put it into a deep freezer and have kept them for 6 months, and it's still very fresh. So the colder is definitely better. There's nothing wrong with the refrigerator. The refrigerator is better than room temperature. But if you got no other choice, room temperature, you can keep it at room temperature for at least a couple weeks past roast. Some coffees are actually better a week after the roast, by the way. That was something that was a shocker to me when I first heard it. You can get some nice African coffees, light roasted it, and they right off the roasting machine is not their best flavor. And it's because there's still reactions going in. There's still bottled up pressures of carbon dioxide. They don't extract as well. People typically wait 2 or 3 days, 4 days before brewing a fresh roast. So another tidbit of information.
Mina actually just wrote a question, or said she was told to keep her coffee in a vacuum sealed container, but the ball jar isn't. Does it matter?
Vacuum containers are good. If they have a nice plastic that's a barrier against the oxygen, I can't imagine them being any worse than a ball jar. So also some coffees are supplied in bags that have nitrogen filled in them. That's another way of keeping out oxygen and preserving coffee. It's not an option for me and a lot of people at home, and especially once you open the bag, they tend to go bad quick. But keep that in mind: is that your enemy is the oxygen. If you keep that out, you're gonna battle most of the problems that coffee has.
All right. Well, does anybody have any more questions? You can also unmute yourself and ask if you don't want to use the chat. Oh, there we go. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, so I apologize. Never seen this before, but do you think that the Kopi Luwak coffee is overrated? Any expensive coffee you think is worth the price?
I think some of the specialty coffees, the very expensive stuff, and I tell you, I've seen some very expensive coffees. When you start roasting your own coffees, you actually can find coffees that are easily $50, $60 a bag of green beans, pre-roasted. If you don't have the proper brew method and you don't know how to adjust to get the right sweet spot, I don't think they're worth buying. You're not going to get the best out of those coffees. So that's my opinion there. But if you can and you do want to spend the time to learn really well how to dial in and get the best out of your brew, and I think also going to a stronger brew method, either with an AeroPress or something that actually, like an espresso, that can pull out the flavors more intensely, also aid getting better coffees, because you can then taste them all. There's a lot of complexity in some of those expensive coffees that you would normally not taste if it was a weaker brew. So if you're doing all that, then I would recommend trying it. When you get a really good coffee and you dialed it in just right. I told somebody at work this the other day, it resets all your thinking. Just be warned that it makes you also spend a lot more money on equipment. So when you dial in a coffee and get it right, yeah, it changes your thinking. If you're anybody like me, anyway.
Someone asked, wouldn't very cold coffee, when opened, cause condensation on the coffee?
Yes, it does. And actually, condensation is not a bad thing. I actually, and this is another little tip, if you hand grind like with this grinder here, you get static cling with really dry coffee. And so a technique that's actually becoming very common nowadays is to put a little drop of water in your dried coffee beans. Frozen coffee beans tend to absorb the water just coming out of the freezer. That little amount of water in the grinder eliminates completely all the static cling that you would normally get. And it's a lot nicer that way. It pours so much nicer, you don't end up making nearly as much of a mess. And it actually ends up extracting better as well. So, yeah.
All right.
I guess that being said, if you don't want to get your fresh roasted coffee wet and then store it in a cabinet, that would do bad things to your coffee. So you really want to get the moisture to hit your coffee just before you grind it and use it.
Does anyone have any more questions? Well, thank you again, Ed. This was really great.
I hope you liked it. I'm willing to have more of these. Like I showed you earlier, I have a roaster here. If anybody wants to see a presentation on coffee being roasted, That's something that's a possibility if you want to get into cold brews. That's another nice talk to get into. Maybe we can actually do some brewing with any particular brewer. I'm willing to do anything like that. Just let us know.
All right, and we'll be sure to send out the recap later, and we'll send out a video of this, a recording of this video of this presentation. So thank you again, Ed, and thank you, Pam, for filming. Do you guys mind just staying for a moment after everyone leaves, just to recap?
Sure.
Okay. And thank you, everyone, for attending.